The morning of Friday, October 19th, 1973, dawned in Havenwood, Kentucky, with an uncharacteristic, almost oppressive stillness, the kind of autumnal silence that often precedes a major shift in the meteorological or, tragically, the human condition, and the lingering scent of damp fallen leaves mingled with the exhaust of the school bus beginning its methodical circuit through the winding, tree-lined residential streets. And for the five friends who formed the inseparable core of their sophomore class, Evelyn Reed, the pragmatic anchor; Thomas Vance, the wry, aspiring cartoonist; Sarah Jenkins, the delicate soul with a laugh like wind chimes; Mark O'Connell, the thoughtful protector; and Peter Hollis, the charismatic, restless dreamer. It was set to be an utterly unremarkable Friday, merely a necessary prelude to the weekend's freedom, a freedom they planned to spend at the abandoned quarry, an illicit rite of passage for teenagers in a town where the most exciting event of the year was the annual church picnic. And Evelyn, always the first ready, a creature of precise habit, remembered noting the precise time on the grandfather clock in the hall as she grabbed her worn leather satchel, 7:28 a.m., a detail she would replay thousands of times in the ensuing decades, a minuscule, irrelevant fragment of a world that was about to shatter, a world where Thomas had just finished a hasty breakfast, leaving his coffee, a bitter concoction he pretended to enjoy to seem more adult, still half full on the counter, the steam already dissipating into the chilly air. And Sarah, fussing over a loose thread on her favorite sweater, lingered for an extra moment, kissing her mother goodbye with an unusual, tender intensity, a moment of filial connection that would soon be calcified into the sharpest point of her mother's permanent, unceasing regret, and if only that would haunt her waking and sleeping hours, because the tragedy, a slow-moving storm visible only in retrospect, was already in motion, drawing them inexorably toward a fateful confluence of time and place that no small-town innocence could possibly withstand, a predatory impulse lurking in the shadows of a community built on trust and unlocked doors. The five teenagers gathered at the usual corner, a weathered oak tree marking the boundary between the well-maintained lawns of the established families and the slightly rougher, more rural edge of Havenwood, their collective energy a vibrant, kinetic force against the backdrop of the quiet, conservative town, their conversations a whirlwind of upcoming football games, shared inside jokes, and the eternal, perplexing mystery of the opposite sex, oblivious to the fact that this casual assembly was the last time the five of them would ever stand together in the ordinary light of day. And when the bright yellow bus pulled up, its brakes hissing a temporary farewell to the mundane, Peter, always the one with the boldest ideas, leaned in, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur, suggesting they skip the excruciating double period of American history that afternoon and head out early to the quarry to stake out the best spot for the bonfire. A seemingly trivial suggestion, an act of rebellion so minor as to be inconsequential, yet it was the hinge upon which their entire future would violently turn, and Evelyn, the cautious one, initially hesitated, citing a quiz, but Mark, driven by a desire to impress Peter and perhaps a nascent, unspoken need to spend more time near Sarah, quickly agreed, and the others, swept up in the magnetic field of Peter's easy charisma, followed suit, a consensus reached with the reckless abandon of youth, sealing a pact that would soon be interpreted by grieving parents and weary investigators as an act of profound, almost culpable folly, the first of many agonizing missteps examined under the unforgiving scrutiny of a cold case review. Because at 3:15 p.m., when the final bell of Havenwood High School rang its cheerful, insistent chime, the five friends executed their plan, slipping out the side door, bypassing the main exit where a casual observer might have noted their absence, and piled into Thomas's beat-up, powder-blue Ford Falcon, affectionately nicknamed the Blue Blur, despite its consistent mechanical reluctance, the sound of its sputtering engine, a final, audible marker of their departure from the ordered world, a sound that quickly faded into the rustle of the autumn woods as they drove out toward the derelict limestone quarry, a local landmark now half filled with murky, unsettlingly deep water, a place known for its isolation and its inherent, unspoken dangers, the perfect venue for a secret gathering, but also, as time would tragically confirm, the perfect stage for an act of incomprehensible cruelty, a canvas upon which a hidden predator could operate with terrifying impunity, unobserved by the usual patrols of a drowsy, trusting community. The quarry, a deep, jagged scar carved into the earth by decades of mining, was eerily quiet when they arrived shortly after 3:30 p.m., the setting sun already casting long, distorted shadows across the sheer rock face and the still, dark water below, the air noticeably cooler, damp with the moisture rising from the reservoir, and they spent the first hour in a state of suspended, carefree joy, exploring the old machinery sheds, collecting dried wood for the planned bonfire, and engaging in the kind of meandering, intimate conversation that defines the cusp of adulthood, a period of shared dreams and emerging anxieties. And it was Peter, always exploring the edges, who first spotted the flicker of something unusual near the tree line. A small, almost imperceptible movement, and he, driven by a youthful blend of curiosity and bravado, decided to investigate alone, brushing off Mark's offer to accompany him with a dismissive wave, a gesture so casual, so characteristic of Peter's self-assured independence, that it was instantly forgotten, swallowed by the immediacy of their group laughter, a piece of mundane interaction that would later be tortuously dissected by investigators seeking a pre-mortem clue, a hint of danger they should have recognized. And 20 minutes passed, then 30, the light beginning to fade in earnest, painting the sky in melancholic shades of bruised purple and deep orange. And the others, now realizing Peter's absence was stretching beyond the bounds of a mere prank, began to call his name, their voices echoing off the quarry walls, the initial playful tone giving way to a nascent, unnerving anxiety, a sudden realization that the familiar security of their group had been breached, that the isolation they had sought had become a liability. And Thomas, practical even in his growing alarm, pulled out the keys to the Falcon, suggesting they drive the perimeter road to look for him, a plan that made immediate, desperate sense. And as they moved toward the car, a low, guttural sound, indistinct and fleeting, drifted from the dense woods, a sound that Mark, raised on a farm, instinctually recognized as a struggle, an immediate, undeniable indicator of violent physical distress. And without a second thought, his protective instinct overriding all caution, he shouted for the others to wait and plunged into the woods toward the source of the sound, leaving Evelyn, Sarah, and Thomas standing frozen by the car, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying shift from teenage adventure to unimaginable peril, a trio of witnesses to the beginning of a silence that would last for half a century, a moment of collective stasis that marked the point of no return, the exact second when the ordinary thread of their lives was irrevocably severed by a hidden, malicious force that seemed to materialize from the very stillness of the Kentucky woods, confirming the dreadful irony that the abandoned quarry, a symbol of their youthful freedom, had instead become a meticulous, chilling trap laid by a cunning predator who understood the dark allure of secluded places. The silence that followed Mark's desperate plunge into the tree line was not an absence of sound, but a profound, heavy quiet, broken only by the frantic, shallow breathing of the three remaining teenagers, a silence punctuated by the distant, disembodied call of a late-season crow, a sound of ill omen that seemed to hover malevolently over the scene. And Evelyn, her pragmatic mind fighting through the fog of shock, was the first to regain a semblance of control, her voice surprisingly steady despite the rapid, visible tremor in her hands, stating with clinical precision that they needed to get help to drive to the nearest house. And Thomas, already fumbling with the car door, his face a mask of sick, adrenaline-fueled dread, nodded mutely. But Sarah, pale and seemingly detached, her eyes fixed on the dark, impenetrable wall of the forest, where her two friends had vanished, whispered a single, chilling word. "No!" Her voice thin and high, almost a shriek, claiming she saw something, a fleeting movement, a shape, and she, against the desperate, pleading shouts of Evelyn and Thomas, broke free and ran toward the woods, following the path Mark had taken only moments before, an act of impulsive, agonizing loyalty that sealed her fate and plunged the unfolding tragedy into an irreversible nightmare of mass disappearance, leaving Evelyn and Thomas alone in the rapidly deepening twilight, victims of a terrifying vacuum, witnessing the last vestiges of their safe, structured world dissolve into the terrifying anarchy of the unknown. And Thomas, his limited mechanical experience insufficient for the high-stakes moment, fumbled desperately with the reluctant engine of the Falcon, the grinding sound of the starter motor, a cruel mockery of their need for speed, a maddening delay that seemed to stretch into an eternity of mounting fear. And when the engine finally caught, roaring to life with a triumphant temporary surge, Evelyn, without a word, pointed toward the access road, her eyes wide with a combination of terror and rigid determination, her mind already calculating the distance, the time, the agonizing possibility of what they might find, or, worse, not find. But they had driven barely 50 yards down the narrow, rutted track when a figure emerged abruptly from the underbrush, a man, indistinct in the fading light, moving with an unnatural, almost predatory speed, blocking the narrow passage with a commanding, authoritative presence, a man whose face was initially obscured by shadow, his clothing dark and unremarkable, blending seamlessly with the surrounding environment. But his posture, the sheer, undeniable force of his sudden appearance, radiated a silent, terrifying certainty, an absolute control over the terrain and the unfolding catastrophe, and Thomas slammed on the brakes, the tires spitting gravel, the sudden, violent stop throwing both teenagers forward against their seatbelts, the initial shock quickly giving way to an immediate, visceral understanding that they had driven not towards safety, but directly into the heart of the danger that had consumed their friends. And the man approached the driver's side window, his face finally visible in the dim light filtering from the Falcon's dashboard, a face that was unnervingly ordinary, neither monstrous nor obviously menacing, yet its placid, almost bland features concealed an oceanic depth of calculated malice. And before either Thomas or Evelyn could articulate a thought, scream, or attempt a desperate maneuver, the man, moving with a terrifying economy of motion, reached into the vehicle, his hand moving with a speed that belied his unthreatening appearance, the glint of metal catching the last vestiges of the sun's fading light, a silent, sudden, and brutally effective interruption of their escape, a final, chilling, punctuation mark on the end of a Friday afternoon that had begun with the promise of carefree, youthful rebellion and ended in a desolate, forgotten corner of Havenwood, swallowed whole by the silent, indifferent wilderness. The immediate aftermath was characterized by a chaotic, almost improvisational response from the Havenwood Police Department, a small, underfunded force accustomed to dealing with minor infractions, stray livestock, and domestic disputes, utterly unprepared for the chilling, impossible scenario of 5 teenagers vanishing without a trace from a secluded local landmark, a crime of such magnitude that it instantly shattered the town's carefully cultivated illusion of small-town safety and triggered a wave of collective, paralyzing fear that swept through the community like a sudden, unexpected cold front, and the only evidence initially recovered was Thomas Vance's Ford Falcon, found abandoned with the keys still in the ignition, driver's side door ajar, the interior showing no signs of a struggle, an unnerving detail that suggested the apprehension of Thomas and Evelyn had been swift, surprising, and overwhelmingly complete, a testament to the predator's calculated efficiency. And Chief of Police Robert Bob Miller, a man 5 years from retirement who had never once drawn his sidearm in the line of duty, found himself at the epicenter of a media storm and a desperate, rapidly escalating investigation, facing the unthinkable horror of having 5 missing minors, one of whom was the daughter of the local mayor, compounding the political pressure with the personal tragedy and the ensuing search, a massive multi-agency effort involving the Kentucky State Police, countless local volunteers, and eventually the FBI, was a logistical nightmare compounded by the rough, sprawling terrain surrounding the quarry, a labyrinth of abandoned mine shafts, thick forest and deep water, where every promising clue turned into a dead end. Every rustle of leaves was a false alarm, and every hour that passed only served to heighten the family's despair and solidify the investigators' growing, sickening dread. And the search teams, painstakingly combing through the same square footage for days, found only minuscule, maddening fragments. A single, mud-caked sneaker, identified as Sarah Jenkins, found nearly a mile from the quarry entrance, deliberately placed on a low-hanging branch, an overt, unsettling taunt from the perpetrator, a half-smoked cigarette butt, a brand unfamiliar to the teenagers, discovered near where the Falcon was abandoned, and most significantly and disturbingly, a small, blood-soaked piece of flannel cloth, later confirmed through forensic analysis to match a shirt owned by Peter Hollis, found near the dense thicket where Mark O'Connell had first run, but the amount of blood was insufficient to indicate a fatality, suggesting a serious injury but raising the equally terrifying possibility of prolonged captivity, thought that haunted every member of the investigation team and fueled the frantic, desperate search efforts, which continued for weeks, driven by the impossible hope of a miracle, until the autumn rains turned to winter sleet, coating the unyielding landscape in a layer of icy, indifferent silence, and the massive search effort, having exhausted all leads and all physical terrain, was reluctantly scaled back to a persistent but increasingly somber cold case review, the official file, thick with inconclusive reports and agonizingly detailed, fruitless interviews marked by a date, November 28, 1973, the official designation shifting from missing persons to cold case homicide, presumed, a bureaucratic adjustment that felt like a final devastating pronouncement of defeat to the 5 shattered families, marking the point where hope gave way to the endless corrosive vigil of grief. The years that followed the vanishing of the Havenwood Five became a testament to the corrosive yet strangely unifying nature of unresolved tragedy, an open wound in the collective memory of the town, which now carried the unspoken, heavy burden of being the place where 5 lives simply ceased to exist. And the families of the victims, their lives fundamentally, irreparably altered, moved through an endless, agonizing cycle of public grieving and private, torturous pursuit, their living rooms transforming into shrine-like war rooms, dominated by meticulously maintained corkboards covered in faded maps, grainy photos of their children, and convoluted theories scrawled on yellowing newspaper clippings. And Evelyn Reed's mother, Eleanor, initially the most composed, became a public face of the tragedy, organizing the town's relentless annual candlelight vigils, her quiet, unwavering tenacity a source of both inspiration and deep-seated pity from the community, her once vibrant eyes now holding the permanent, desolate gaze of a mother searching for an answer that was never coming, while Thomas Vance's father, a man of simple, forthright honesty, retreated into a silent, alcohol-fueled despair, unable to reconcile the sudden, violent loss with the orderly world he had always believed in, a perfect illustration of how the trauma of a cold case does not simply kill the victims, but slowly, inexorably, devours the lives of those left behind, leaving behind only the husks of their former selves. And Detective Frank Harrison, the young Kentucky State Police investigator assigned as the lead on the original case, a man who carried the heavy weight of the unresolved investigation like an invisible, crippling scar, a constant low-level thrum of professional failure, saw the 5 missing faces in every late-night call, in every cold cup of coffee, the case becoming a defining, soul-crushing monolith in his otherwise distinguished career. The lack of resolution, a personal affront that robbed him of sleep and peace. And in the late 1990s, almost 25 years later, as new forensic technologies began to revolutionize crime-solving, Harrison, now a captain nearing retirement, championed the re-examination of the remaining physical evidence, focusing specifically on the enigmatic, half-smoked cigarette butt and the minute fibers recovered from the blood-soaked flannel patch, authorizing the creation of a cold case storage unit for the evidence, an air-conditioned, meticulously maintained vault in the KSP headquarters, ensuring the integrity of the fragile, irreplaceable fragments of the past, the final, tangible links to the 5 missing souls, a bureaucratic but profoundly empathetic act driven by a quiet, unwavering devotion to the families, a desperate professional prayer that science could succeed where raw manpower and early investigative techniques had failed, hoping that the nascent science of DNA analysis, still in its infancy during the initial investigation, might someday crack the protective shell of silence that had surrounded the Havenwood Five for a quarter-century, a silence as thick and unyielding as the quarry stone itself. The transition from 1973 to the late 1990s and into the new millennium was marked not by sudden revelations, but by a grinding, melancholic accumulation of time, each passing year adding another layer of dust and disappointment to the Havenwood case file, which had swelled into a massive, multi-volume repository of heartbreak, a tangible monument to unsolved suffering. And the town, forever cleaved into the before and the after, developed a complicated, almost protective relationship with its tragedy, the annual remembrance vigils shifting from desperate calls for information to somber, necessary rituals of collective grief, ensuring the names, Evelyn, Thomas, Sarah, Mark and Peter, remained vibrant against the relentless tide of forgetting. And the central figure of this enduring vigilance became Eleanor Reed, Evelyn's mother, whose grief, rather than diminishing, had calcified into a formidable, professional tenacity, transforming her from a grieving parent into an amateur yet highly effective investigator, tirelessly lobbying state legislators, maintaining a detailed, cross-referenced log of every tip, no matter how outlandish, and mastering the arcane language of forensic science as it evolved, her dining room table permanently covered in photocopies of police reports, a personal, unwavering counter-investigation that provided the only psychological defense against the debilitating realization that the police had moved on to newer, solvable crimes, and she established a rapport with the now Captain Frank Harrison, a relationship built on mutual, weary respect, exchanging annual Christmas cards that contained not holiday cheer but terse updates on evidence preservation and potential new avenues for testing, their bond forged in the crucible of shared failure, an unspoken agreement that the case would not truly die until they both did, and the physical evidence, the few precious fragments recovered from the site, became the focus of their decades-long vigil, particularly the mysterious cigarette butt and the trace fibers, now housed within the climate-controlled austerity of the KSP cold case vault, shielded from the elements but not from the inexorable march of scientific progress. And in the year 2002, a significant, albeit initially disappointing, step was taken when a federal grant allowed the KSP to send the cigarette butt, carefully preserved in a sterile envelope for nearly 3 decades, to a cutting-edge private lab for mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA analysis, a technique still relatively new, which could isolate a profile from the minuscule epidermal cells likely transferred from the smoker's lips, and the lab returned a partial, haplogroup-specific genetic profile, not enough for a definitive match in the burgeoning CODIS database, but sufficient to establish a maternal line lineage and rule out certain populations. The profile designated simply as unknown male 1973, a frustratingly small victory that proved the attacker was a male who possessed a specific set of inherited, non-identifying mitochondrial markers, a profile that languished uselessly in the police files for another 16 years, a ghost profile waiting for a technology capable of transforming a shadow into a suspect, a perfect example of the slow, methodical pace of cold case investigation, where years are spent waiting for science to catch up with the crime, a patience that only the deepest grief can sustain until the quiet, unassuming breakthrough that finally came in 2018, nearly 45 years after the disappearance, originating not from a police lab, but from the public sphere of commercial genetic genealogy, a tool that bypassed traditional criminal justice databases by leveraging the vast, voluntary genetic data provided by millions of citizens seeking to understand their ancestry, a technological marvel that Captain Harrison, now retired but serving as a volunteer consultant, immediately recognized as the key, a final, desperate chance to unlock the secret held captive by the Kentucky quarry for so long. The breakthrough, which felt like a sudden, blinding flash of light after decades spent navigating in the dark, began with the delicate extraction of the nuclear DNA profile from the remnant epithelial cells on the 25-year-old blood-stained flannel patch belonging to Peter Hollis, a procedure painstakingly executed by Dr. Elena Ramirez, a young, brilliant forensic geneticist who viewed the cold case evidence not as dusty relics, but as meticulously archived narratives waiting to be told, and the nuclear profile, unlike the limited mtDNA from the cigarette, contained the full, rich genetic signature of unknown male 1973, a unique genetic fingerprint, and once the full YSTR and autosomal profiles were complete, they were not uploaded to the standard, police-restricted CODIS database, which was yielding no matches, but instead, with Evelyn Reed's fierce protective insistence and Captain Harrison's quiet, persistent lobbying, the profile was converted into a specialized data format compatible with the public genetic genealogy databases, a controversial, boundary-pushing technique at the time, but one that was rapidly becoming the last resort for the truly cold, intractable cases, and the initial search, conducted in May of 2019, yielded an immediate high-confidence match not to the perpetrator himself, but to a third-cousin match, a man living 3 states away who had submitted his DNA years earlier for genealogical curiosity, a distant relative whose shared genetic markers provided the necessary leverage to build a complex, multi-generational family tree stretching back to the early 1900s, a painstaking, meticulous task that involved weeks of archival research, cross-referencing census data, birth and death certificates, and public records, a process that demanded the cold, objective logic of a computer scientist and the intuitive narrative skill of a historian, a process that ultimately narrowed the suspect pool from millions of potential individuals to a specific lineage within Havenwood, all descendants of a certain Kentuckian farming family who had lived within a 5-mile radius of the quarry in 1973, and this narrowing process, combined with the initial partial mtDNA profile, allowed Dr. Ramirez's team to isolate the 2 prime suspects, 2 brothers, both living in Havenwood in the 70s, both matching the estimated age and location profile, one of whom, a man named Arthur Vance, had a familiar surname, a discovery that sent a jolt of icy, visceral shock through the investigation team, creating an immediate, agonizing ethical dilemma that required the utmost discretion and care, given the complex layers of communal tragedy already engulfing the families, especially the possibility that the perpetrator was connected, however distantly, to one of the victims. The suspect was identified not as Arthur Vance, but as the second brother, Gerald Vance, a 72-year-old retired groundskeeper, and, more disturbingly, the first cousin of Thomas Vance, one of the missing boys, a staggering, horrifying irony that confirmed the most cynical, devastating suspicion of the cold case detective. The killer was not a faceless stranger, but a trusted member of the community, a wolf in familial sheep's clothing, and the realization that the predator had been hiding in plain sight for 45 years, attending the same church, possibly even offering condolences to the victims' families, sent a ripple of icy disbelief through the small, focused KSP team, and the final piece of irrefutable evidence required was a definitive DNA sample from Vance, obtained under strict surveillance, meticulously documented to ensure its legal viability, and Captain Harrison, now officially brought back to head the arrest phase, devised a quiet, low-profile collection strategy, leveraging Vance's routine visits to a local diner, where a discarded coffee cup, carefully retrieved from the trash bin by an undercover officer, provided the necessary, pristine genetic material, and the subsequent rush testing confirmed the absolute, undeniable match. The nuclear profile from the coffee cup was an exact match to unknown male 1973, the killer who had vanished 5 teenagers 4 decades prior, and the sheer weight of this final, devastating confirmation, the intersection of a half-century-old crime with the 21st century's most advanced technology, was a profoundly moving moment for the investigative team, a blend of relief and sorrow, the satisfaction of resolution inextricably linked to the devastating realization of the identity, and the arrest was planned for the morning of Tuesday, October 27, 2019, a deliberate, quiet operation intended to avoid the sensationalism that had plagued the original investigation, taking place not at Vance's modest home, but at his part-time job assisting with groundskeeping at the old Havenwood cemetery, a final chilling irony that the man who had concealed 5 bodies for 45 years was apprehended while tending to the resting places of others, a perfect, sinister tableau of the hidden-in-plain-sight device that defines the most unsettling true crime narratives, and the shockwaves of the arrest were immediate and seismic, tearing through the quiet fabric of Havenwood with the force of an earthquake, especially among the Vance family, who were forced to grapple not only with the loss of their relative, Thomas, but the horrifying realization that another relative, Gerald, was the person responsible for the unimaginable act, creating a permanent toxic stain on the family legacy, a devastating revelation that confirmed the persistent, agonizing truth whispered by the victims' families for decades. Someone knew, someone saw, and that someone was intimately connected to their lives. The moment of the arrest, captured only by the subdued, high-definition camera of the surveillance team, lacked the dramatic intensity of a typical police raid, instead carrying the solemn, heavy air of a long-delayed reckoning, the culmination of a half-century of waiting, and Gerald Vance, confronted by Captain Harrison and 2 KSP officers, offered no resistance, his 72-year-old frame seeming to shrink under the weight of the accusation, his reaction not one of surprise or defiant denial, but a chilling, quiet resignation, a man who had clearly carried the invisible, crushing burden of his secret for 45 years. And Harrison, the man who had lost his first major case to the silence of the woods, now stood opposite the man who had imposed that silence, his voice steady but carrying the accumulated weight of decades of frustration, reading the Miranda warning that Vance accepted with a simple, almost polite nod, and transported to the KSP barracks for questioning. Vance initially maintained a stoic, almost impenetrable silence, clinging to the false hope that without the physical bodies, the evidence would remain circumstantial, a legal tactic that crumbled quickly under the weight of Dr. Ramirez's forensic genetic evidence, presented with clinical, irrefutable precision, connecting his DNA to the blood-soaked flannel and the epithelial cells on the cigarette butt, an unbreakable chain of evidence that left no room for doubt or evasion. And it was only when Harrison, in a calculated, empathetic move, showed him the aged, faded photographs of the 5 teenagers, Evelyn with her pragmatic gaze, Thomas with his wry smile, Sarah with her delicate beauty, Mark with his thoughtful intensity, and Peter with his restless charisma, that Vance finally broke, not with a burst of rage, but with a slow, agonizing slide into a torrent of confessions, a narrative of suppressed memory and meticulously constructed lies that poured out of him over the course of the next 12 hours, a complete, unvarnished account of the 45-year-old crime, revealing the chilling details of the disposal site and the precise, terrifying motive that had driven the impulsive, violent act. And the bodies, he finally admitted, were not in the quarry water, a location searched hundreds of times, nor in the obvious surrounding woods, but buried deep within the foundation of an abandoned, unmarked structure on the extreme eastern edge of the quarry property, a structure that had been raised years earlier and then covered over with successive layers of fill dirt, an almost perfectly concealed geological grave, confirming the police's worst fear that the teenagers had been murdered shortly after their abduction. The final resting place, a meticulous, cynical act of deception designed to withstand any traditional search, a secret that Gerald Vance, now stripped of his anonymity and his freedom, was finally ready to surrender, ending the agonizing cycle of hope and loss that had defined the existence of the Havenwood five families for nearly 5 decades. The confession of Gerald Vance, a narrative of cold, calculated precision delivered with an unnerving lack of remorse, immediately initiated the final, most somber phase of the 46-year-old investigation, the recovery of the bodies, an operation codenamed Resolution that was executed with the meticulous, reverent care of an archaeological dig, recognizing the site not merely as a crime scene, but as a sacred, long-denied burial ground. And the location, precisely described by Vance during his hours-long interrogation, was an isolated, heavily overgrown stretch of land on the eastern periphery of the quarry, near the crumbling remains of an old maintenance shed that had been officially demolished and buried beneath layers of construction debris and soil in the early 1980s, a perfect, cynical act of architectural concealment, rendering the space invisible to all standard search patterns and ground-penetrating radar employed decades earlier. And on Wednesday, October 28, 2019, under the watchful, discreet presence of Captain Harrison and Dr. Ramirez, a specialized forensic anthropology team began the painstaking process of excavation, employing heavy machinery to remove the overburdened soil, and then shifting to hand tools and brushes as they approached the foundation level, a deliberate slow-motion uncovering that was followed in hushed, agonizing silence by Evelyn Reed and other family representatives who were positioned hundreds of yards away, shielded from the immediate visual trauma, but profoundly connected to the emotional epicenter of the operation. A vigil that lasted 3 days and culminated in the discovery of 5 distinct shallow graves beneath the poured concrete slab of the former structure, where the earth had been meticulously disturbed and then resealed, a chilling testament to Vance's premeditated, almost structural approach to eliminating his victims and securing his secrecy. And the recovery itself was a complex, heartbreaking process. Each skeletal remained treated as an irreplaceable artifact, carefully mapped, documented, and lifted. The remains of Evelyn Reed, Thomas Vance, Sarah Jenkins, Mark O'Connell, and Peter Hollis finally seeing the light after 46 years of darkness, identified definitively through dental records and the enduring, unbreakable link of maternal mitochondrial DNA, confirming the full, agonizing extent of the tragedy and providing the physical closure that the families had desperately sought for nearly 5 decades. A moment of profound, bittersweet relief where the abstract horror of a disappearance finally crystallized into the concrete, devastating reality of loss, a confirmation that allowed the long-deferred, essential process of mourning to finally begin, transforming the endless, corrosive weight into a finite, if tragic, truth. The trial of Gerald Vance, which commenced in the summer of 2021, was a condensed, intense legal spectacle that served less as a search for truth and more as a public airing of 46 years of suppressed anguish, a final, necessary confrontation between the families and the man who had stolen their future. And Vance, his composure unsettlingly intact throughout the proceedings, relying on the detached procedural language of his confession, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of diminished capacity, a legal maneuver that was swiftly and thoroughly dismantled by the prosecution, whose case was built entirely upon the cold, hard certainty of the forensic genealogy evidence and the detailed, self-incriminating nature of Vance's own narrative, a narrative that revealed the chilling motive behind the impulsive abduction. Vance, then 26 and a struggling, deeply resentful quarry worker living on the periphery of the town's social life, had been secretly watching the 5 teenagers, drawn to their carefree spirit and their sense of entitlement, which he perceived as a direct insult to his own stagnant, unfulfilled existence. And the opportunity arose when he was unexpectedly performing illegal, off-the-books maintenance at the quarry property, encountering the group shortly after Peter Hollis split off from the others, initially targeting Peter alone in a moment of intoxicated, opportunity-driven rage, a confrontation that quickly escalated, resulting in Peter's injury and Mark's attempt at intervention, forcing Vance to realize he needed to eliminate all witnesses to preserve his secret, a sequence of events he described with the unnerving emotional flatness of a man recounting a long-ago chore, detailing the subsequent brutal apprehension of Sarah, Evelyn, and his own cousin Thomas, the systematic, chilling violence and the meticulously planned concealment of the bodies, a motive steeped in envy, resentment, and a desire to impose silence on a world he felt had ignored him. And the victims' families, led by Evelyn Reed, offered powerful emotional testimony, transforming the abstract figures in the case file into vibrant, living memories, recounting the potential futures that had been violently erased. Evelyn's planned enrollment at the State University, Thomas's artistic talent, Sarah's empathetic kindness, Mark's loyalty, and Peter's unbounded energy, their words serving as a devastating collective eulogy, the courtroom becoming a crucible for decades of bottled-up pain, culminating in the jury's swift verdict of guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder, a decision rendered after only 4 hours of deliberation, ensuring that Gerald Vance, the quiet neighbor, the trusted cousin, would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated, a final, conclusive act of justice that brought a measure of public resolution to the community, if not true peace to the irreparably damaged families. The aftermath of the trial and conviction was marked by a necessary profound shift from the agonizing pursuit of truth to the difficult, equally profound work of memorialization and recovery, a process that demanded the community not only confront the horror of the crime but also honor the endurance of the victim's memory, and the remains of the 5 friends, finally released to their families, were interred in the old Havenwood cemetery, the very location where Gerald Vance had been apprehended, in a shared plot, beneath a single, simple granite monument, etched with their names and the poignant dates, 1957-1973, a symbolic reunion in death that mirrored their final, inseparable moments in life. And the local historical society, spearheaded by Evelyn Reed, now an authoritative figure in the town's history, established the Havenwood 5 Memorial Scholarship Fund, dedicated to students pursuing studies in forensic science and law enforcement, a lasting, tangible legacy that transformed the tragedy into a catalyst for the prevention and resolution of future crimes, ensuring that Evelyn's, Thomas's, Sarah's, Mark's and Peter's names would be perpetually linked to a force for good, a small act of defiance against the killer's attempt to erase their potential. And Captain Frank Harrison, having finally achieved the closure that had eluded him for decades, retired permanently, his professional conscience finally at peace, knowing that the file he carried like a phantom limb was at last complete, the justice delivered not by the technology of his era, but by the relentless, evolving science of a new generation, a poetic testament to the enduring power of human curiosity and technological innovation in the face of absolute malice. And the town of Havenwood, slowly, tentatively, began the complex process of healing, recognizing that the stain of the crime would forever be a part of their identity, a reminder that the greatest threats often come not from the outside, but from the quiet, trusted corners of their own lives, concluding the decades-long nightmare with a solemn, bittersweet resolution. The chilling Kentucky cold case of 1973 finally solved, its resolution a testament to the tenacity of love, the enduring power of forensic science, and the quiet, unyielding commitment of a few individuals who refused to let 5 young lives simply vanish into the indifferent silence of the autumn woods.